Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our event. My name is Philippe Liste. I'm replacing the chair for political science and global governance at the university. And this talk tonight is co-organized by the Center for Globalization and Governance at the university and the Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung. So it's very good to have this kind of cooperation between the university and the institute, and especially the Center for Globalization and Governance and this institute here. And even better to have the cooperation with such a wonderful guest. So let me welcome Professor Philippe Sands. What a pleasure to have you here. So let me just say a few words about our guest. And after that introduction, Philippe will talk about 45 minutes or so. Is that fine with you? And then we will have time for discussion. And after the discussion, there will be even more time for discussion with a glass of wine in our hands, hopefully. So it will be fine, I think. So Philippe Sands, a Queen's Counsel, by the way, is a barrister at Matrix Chambers in London. And
that's not a coffee maker.
But not only that, also professor of law at the University College London, so UCL, where he's also director of the Center on International Courts and Tribunals. So he's expert on a wide spectrum in international law. And in doing so, he's not only teaching on international law and writing books on international law, he's also participating in, say, a process of everyday production and reproduction of international law. So he's applying it as he has appeared in a number of national and international courts and court cases. And this includes a number of really landmark cases that every student of international law will know, or will at least learn to know in the first semesters on international law, in the international law seminars. So let me name only a few of the cases. So there is this nuclear weapons case at the International Court of Justice that was in the 90s already. More recently, he was participating in the whaling in the Antarctic case, so when Japan was sued by Australia, and I think later on New Zealand intervened in that case too. Philippe participated in the international negotiations on the Rome Statute, which is the international law treaty founding the International Criminal Court in The Hague. He was also involved in the so-called Pinochet case, so when former President Augusto Pinochet has been prosecuted in Spain and then later on arrested in London for violations of rights in or during the military time of the military junta in Chile. And finally, since we are here in Hamburg, Philippe also appears in the ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas, and so that is actually why he is right now here in Hamburg. So perhaps later on you can also tell us a little bit about that, perhaps. So there is a lot there, you see. And Sands is also author of numerous books and articles, and these are not only books written for a sort of lawyers kind of audience, but also written for a broader audience, including, of course, the book that he's going to talk about today, the East-West Street. But there is more, and I brought some of them. For example, there's this one, which I think is really a bestseller, Lawless Worlds, the whistleblowing account of how Bush and Blair are taking the law into their hands. And another one, and I brought that for a particular reason, called Torture Team, Rumsfeld's Memo and the Betrayal of American Values. So both of these books have been or have become up to date again, unfortunately, during the last days and weeks, so to say. Yeah, and last but not least, the book of today, East-West Street, The Origins of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. That book was awarded the 2016 Baillie Gifford Prize and has been listed for further book prizes also. So you see, I could go on and on with that, which I will not do, but let me add two more things. Philippe Sands also plays a role as a public intellectual, so he's not only writing academic kind of texts, but also writing for newspapers, he's appearing in the media, and related to that book, he has also made a film documentary called My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did. So we can ask him questions about that too later on. So you see, it seems really hard to say what Philippe Sands is working on in a few words. So where is Philippe Sands? That's always difficult to say. Tonight we can say he's here with us. It's a great pleasure. Once again, welcome to Hamburg. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Philip. Vielen Dank. And it's incredibly nice to be in Hamburg. I do come quite often now. It's a city I've come to know quite well. I've long come to understand that my various activities, teaching, writing, litigating cases, are engagements that are very much touched by my background, by the baggage that was attached to me somehow when I came into the world, as each of us comes into this world with a baggage attached to us. I was not a clean slate, a blank slate, and none of us are. In his rather wonderful autobiography, Interesting Times, the historian Eric Hobsbawm observed the complex connection between who we are and what we do. And he noted, as he put it, the profound way in which the interweaving of one person's life and times and the observation of both help shape historical analysis. He was writing as a historian. I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer. And I focus on matters international. And my interest in my academic and professional work is to understand how the law actually functions, how rules come into being, how they are interpreted and applied, how they affect human and governmental behavior. My curiosity about a person's life and times concerns the way in which it might inform the world. And the experiences, my own experiences of the past quarter of a century, point to me to a very clear conclusion. Individual lives and personal histories matter very much, and they make a significant difference. My book, East-West Street, took nearly 7 years to write. It is not about the life of one person, but of 4 people, and it seeks to understand how their particular circumstances contributed to the roads that they took, and how the roads that they traveled changed the system of international law that is my daily activity. But the book also touches a very much more personal theme, and that is how these 4 interweaving lives influenced my path, whether directly or indirectly. And below that issue lurks a much bigger question, and it is one I think that touches each and every one of us in this room, and it's a central question of identity. It poses the question, who am I? Am I an individual, or am I a member of a group, or a combination of these factors? East-West Street came about entirely by chance. It was the spring of 2010. I was living my world in my classroom at University College London, writing academic articles, doing cases in The Hague and Hamburg. And an invitation came out of the blue from the city of Lviv in the Ukraine, from the law faculty at the city of Lviv that used to be called Lemberg under the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918, and then Lvov during the Polish period until 1939, and then Lvov under the Soviet period, and then once again Lemberg for 3 years, and then after that, Lviv. Would I come, the university asked me, to deliver a public lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide? I've done plenty of cases on those subjects, and I've written books about that subject. And in particular, would I talk about what happened at Nuremberg in relation to those two crimes at the trial and its consequences for our modern world today? Yes, I said, I would be delighted to come and give a lecture, and the reason in part was that I've long been fascinated by the trial and by the myths of Nuremberg, by the words, by the images, by the sounds of that trial. It was a catalytic moment. It really was the moment in which our modern system of international justice crystallized into being. I was mesmerized by the points of detail that you could find in the lengthy transcripts, by the terrible evidence, by the memoirs, the diaries that described in forensic detail not just the testimony, but also the love affairs that went on behind the scenes. I loved movies like Judgement at Nuremberg, which won an Oscar in 1961. I loved Spencer Tracy's momentary flirtation with Marlene Dietrich, and I loved the closing line in the film, in the judgment scene of the film, where Spencer Tracy says, "We stand for justice, truth, and the value of a single human life." But there was also a practical reason that I accepted, and that was the trial's influence on my work. It's been very, very profound. With Nuremberg, a wind was blown into the germinal human rights movement. Sure, there was indeed a sense of victor's justice at Nuremberg, no doubt about that, but it was also catalytic. It opened the possibility for the first time that the leaders of a country could be put on trial before an international court. That had never happened before in human history. It must have been my work as a barrister rather than my academic writings, I think, that caused the invitation to be sent from Lviv. In the summer of 1998, as Philip mentioned, I'd been involved in the negotiations in Rome that led to the creation of the International Criminal Court. The preamble is my handiwork, along with my friend Andrew Clapham. And that body, of course, would have jurisdiction over genocide and crimes against humanity and two other crimes. The essential difference between crimes against humanity and genocide is who is protected and why. Assume 10,000 people are killed, murdered, exterminated. The systematic killing of such numbers of individuals will always be a crime against humanity, but will it be a genocide? That depends in law on the intention of the killers and the ability of prosecutors to prove that intention. To establish the crime of genocide, you have to show that the act of killing is motivated by what is called a special intent, the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. If a criminal prosecutor cannot prove that a large number of people have been killed with that intent, then genocide will not be established. And so you have these two crimes operating side by side and overlapping. Every genocide is a crime against humanity, but not every crime against humanity is a genocide. Difference gives rise to a certain pecking order, with genocide now seen by many, particularly in the public, as the crime of crimes, more serious than any other. A few months after both crimes were inscribed in the statute of the International Criminal Court, Senator Pinochet was arrested in London on charges both of genocide and crimes against humanity laid by a Spanish prosecutor. The House of Lords ruled that even as a former president of Chile, he could not claim immunity from English courts, and that was a revolutionary judgment. In the years that followed, the gates of international justice slowly creaked open after 5 decades of quiet after the Nuremberg judgments. Cases from Yugoslavia and Rwanda soon landed on my desk in London, and others followed, and I became involved in cases in the Congo, Libya, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Guantanamo, Iraq. It's a long list. It reflects, that list, the failure of good intentions that were aired in Courtroom 600 at Nuremberg's Palace of Justice. I came to see mass killings for myself. I came to see cases about crimes against humanity and genocide. These two distinct crimes, with their different emphases, the individual on the one hand, the group on the other, have emerged as they have. Occasionally, in my work, I would pick up hints about the origins and purposes of the two terms, and the connection to arguments that were first made in Courtroom 600. And I never really inquired too deeply about what exactly had happened at Nuremberg on those two crimes. I sort of knew generally how the crimes had come into being and how they subsequently developed, but what I didn't know was the personal stories behind them, or how they were actually argued at Nuremberg. And that invitation from Lviv gave me an opportunity to explore those issues. But I didn't accept the invitation for that reason. I accepted the invitation for this reason. This is my grandfather, Leon Buchholz. He was born in Lemberg in 1904. He never spoke to me once in his life, and he lived until 1997, about the city. He would sometimes refer, when speaking in Polish or in German, to Lviv or to Lemberg, but never in a language I could really properly understand. In his wonderful slim volume, Mój Lviv, My Lemberg, My Lviv, which was written in 1946 and has just been published in English for the first time a couple of months ago by Pushkin Press, but is available in German and is an extraordinary read. In English, it's called The City of Lions. In German, I think it's called Mein Lemberg. The Polish poet Joseph Witlin focuses on the idyll of the city. The essence of being a Lwovian, he writes beautifully, is an extraordinary mixture of nobility and roguery, wisdom and imbecility, poetry and vulgarity. And he ends with the idea that nostalgia often likes to falsify flavors, telling us to taste nothing but the sweetness of Lviv today. But, he ends, I know people for whom Lviv was a cup of gall. And it was a cup of gall for my grandfather, Leon. It was very deeply buried, part of a hidden hinterland of which he never spoke to me. So was the city for my mother, who was born in 1938 in Vienna, to where my grandfather had moved in 1914 when the Russians occupied the city. And Lviv, Lemberg must have cast a long shadow over my mother's life too. Leon's silence barely covered the wounds of the family that he left behind in 1914, occasionally would see again, but then lost contact with forever after 1939. But from the very moment I first set foot in the city, in October 2010, it felt incredibly familiar. I liked being there. It was like meeting some sort of long-lost relative. The dark city was part of my DNA. I felt like I had missed it, and I felt incredibly comfortable to be there. The psychoanalyst Nicholas Abraham wrote of his patients that what haunts are the gaps left within us by the secrets of others. And those words really inspired the writing of East-West Street, which will be published by Fischer in Germany in February 2018. Those are the words which open the writing of this book. For what I discovered in writing the book, what I didn't know, was that my grandfather came from an absolutely huge family, one that was centered in Lemberg and the nearby town of Żółkiew. Literally dozens and dozens of uncles and aunts and nephews and nieces and cousins and more distant relatives. And that family grew and grew and grew until 1939, when the war came to the city. By May 1945, of that large family of around 80 people, he was the only one alive. He was the only survivor from the city and from Galicia. I didn't know much about what had happened to him. In 1939, Viennese and now made stateless, he was banished from Vienna because of his religious affiliation. He was Jewish. He moved to Paris, and that was where he lived when I knew him as a Frenchman, although I knew there was some obscure Viennese connection. Preparing for the lecture in October 2010, I was 50 years old, and my mother, for the first time, gave me access to his papers, which I'd never seen before. Amongst those papers, I found this one. It's the expulsion order from the Reich in late 1938, translated into English, it says the Jew Buchholz Morris Leon is required to leave the territory of the German Reich by December the 25th, 1938. He was able to be expelled because he had been made stateless. And right now, that is an issue in modern international law that is extraordinarily important. I had always assumed that he left with his wife Rita, my grandmother, and his one-year-old daughter Ruth, my mother. But in the course of the research that began in 2010, I discovered that this was not the case. And in fact, this, I think, was the real explanation for the silence that hung over our family, which touched all of my family and which touched my childhood. Leon left Vienna in January 1939 and made his way to Paris, but he did so by himself. Only now, having access to his personal papers, could I begin to work out what had actually happened. His daughter travelled to Paris a few months later, in July 1939, and his wife remained in Vienna for 3 more years. And from this, I began to understand that something else had intervened, and of course, being a litigating lawyer, I wanted to find out what it was. Why did my grandfather leave Vienna by himself? How did my mother get to Paris by herself as a child of less than a year? Why did my grandmother remain in Vienna, allowing herself to be separated from her only child at that crucial period, a fact that has, I think, hung over my mother, as it would for any child, knowing that that situation had pertained? These were very big questions, and they hung around the research that I was involved in. I kept going back to the documents that I found in my grandfather's papers looking for clues. I'm a litigator, which is a sort of lesser amateur historian come psychiatrist, and I love scraps of paper. That's my everyday life. I've come to learn that every scrap of paper and every photograph holds information that is not immediately accessible or knowable. This is what I like to think of as the muck of evidence, and I love the muck of evidence. You've got to look carefully, you've got to keep an open mind, you've got to attend to the unexpected, find the dots, try to join them, and persist, persist, persist. Nothing in life is ever quite what it seems. 2 items stood out. This was the first one. A small scrap of thin yellow paper, about 2.5 centimetres by 2.5 centimetres. It was folded in half, one side was blank, and the other contained a name and address written by someone firmly in pencil. The writing seemed to me to be angular and strong. Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. What was it about? The second document that stood out was a very small black and white photograph of this gentleman, taken in 1949. It showed a middle-aged man staring intently into camera. On the back of the photograph, in blue ink, was written, Herzliche Grüße aus Wien, September 1949. Warmest wishes from Vienna. There was a signature, but it was indecipherable to me, and the writing was very firm. When I saw these photographs, the photograph and the scrap of paper, of course I asked my mother, what were they? Why had they been kept? And she said she didn't know who Miss Tilney was, and she didn't know the identity of the man in the bow tie. Yet I knew as a lawyer that when people keep scraps of paper or photographs, they do so for a reason. We know it as human beings. Could they have shed light on what had happened to my grandfather in 1939? I pinned them on the wall above my desk, and they remained there for 3 years as I tried to work out what these pieces of information contained. That summer in 2010, after I'd seen this material, I turned to write the lecture that became the subject of the book. This is a little personal detour, and you'll recall that the lecture was to focus on crimes against humanity and genocide. So let me take you to the first of several coincidences. In preparing that lecture in the summer of 2010, I was frankly astonished to discover that the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into international law in the summer of 1945 came from Lviv. Indeed, he had even been a student at the university that had invited me, but the people at the university were not aware of that fact. His name was Hirsch Lauterpacht, and he's probably the most famous international lawyer of the 20th century. He was born in a small town of Zhulkiev, about 15 miles north of Lviv. He moved to Lviv when he was 14 in 1911, and he enrolled at the university law faculty in 1915. In 1919, he moved to Vienna and spent 4 years studying with the renowned legal philosopher Hans Kelsen, a colleague and friend of Sigmund Freud's. Lauterpacht came to London in 1923 with his new wife to study. He became a renowned academic, first at the London School of Economics and then at Cambridge University. And in 1945, he published the book that laid the foundation for our modern system of human rights. It was called An International Bill of the Rights of Man, and it offered a singular and revolutionary idea. Every individual would have minimum rights under international law, something that did not exist at that time. He even prepared draft articles which covered much that was new, but it was by no means exhaustive. In April 1945, after the war in Europe came to an end, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agreed that there would be a trial for senior Nazi leaders. The British hired Lauterpacht to assist in the prosecution, and he worked with Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor. In July 1945, Jackson came to London from the United States to draft the charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and the four Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, were in fundamental disagreement about the crimes over which the tribunal would exercise jurisdiction. Jackson turned to Lauterpacht for help. On July the 29th of that year, Jackson travelled from his hotel in Mayfair, Claridge's, up to Cambridge and had lunch with the Lauterpachts. They would sit in Lauterpacht's garden together. This is Lauterpacht in his garden in 1945. They discussed the list of crimes. Lauterpacht came up with the idea of putting titles into the Nuremberg Charter because he thought it would help public understanding, and if there was more public understanding, there would be greater public legitimacy. Jackson was positive about the idea, so Lauterpacht took another idea out of his pocket on atrocities committed against civilians. This was a matter that the Americans and the Soviets were deeply divided. Lauterpacht, of course, had a long-standing academic interest in the subject and, of course, also a personal interest in relation to the question of his family, who were somehow still in Lemberg and on which he had no information. He said nothing to Jackson about the situation in Lemberg. Why not, Lauterpacht suggested, refer to the atrocities committed against individuals as crimes against humanity? You can see those words now in Lauterpacht's own hand. The term would cover atrocities against individuals on a large scale, torture, murder, disappearance, and introduce a totally new concept into international law. No instrument had ever used this term. Jackson liked the idea and took it with him back to London, and a few days later it made its way into Article 6C of the Nuremberg Statute, an innovation, Lauterpacht would say, but a vitally important one. Whilst focusing on crimes against humanity, I also turned my attention to genocide, and that brought me to my second astonishing discovery. The man who invented that word in 1944 also passed through the city of Lviv and, remarkably, also studied at the same law school that had invited me. And the people who had invited me were unaware of that fact. You really could not invent the story. I'm telling it as it is. His name, much more famous than Lauterpacht generally, was Rafael Lemkin. He arrived at Lviv University in 1921, 2 years after Lauterpacht had left, and he stayed there until 1926, when he obtained a doctorate in criminal law. He was actually born 500 kilometers to the north on a farm near a small hamlet called Azariska in what is now Belarus. After he left the law school in Lviv, he became a public prosecutor in Warsaw, and in 1933 he wrote a paper for a League of Nations meeting held in Madrid proposing a new international crime to combat what he called barbarity and vandalism against groups of people. His focus, unlike Lauterpacht, was not on the protection of individuals, but on the protection of groups, sometimes referred to as minorities. His ideas bounced around, but nothing came of them, and the timing was, of course, hardly ideal because in that same year, Adolf Hitler had just come to power in Germany. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Lemkin was in Warsaw. He escaped, made his way to Sweden via his parents' town of Volkowisk, which was then under Soviet control, and in 1941 left Stockholm for America. Because the Atlantic Ocean was closed, essentially, he had to travel the long route across Russia, Japan, by boat to Seattle, and then by train to Durham, North Carolina, where he took academic refuge at Duke University. He traveled with almost no money and very few personal belongings, but a vast quantity of luggage. And that luggage contained nothing but paper, literally tens of thousands of decrees that had been promulgated by the Nazis in the countries they had occupied across Europe and which he had gathered whilst he was living in Stockholm with the help of a Swedish company. He gathers these materials, he carts them around the world, arrives in America, and spends 2 years analysing the decrees to see what is the underlying master plan that explains the pattern of activity across the whole of Europe. The book is published in November 1944, and it is called Axis Rule of Occupied Europe. Chapter 9 of the book has this word as its title, genocide, and that is the first recorded publication of the word that he invented at exactly that time. You see it here in his handwriting. Lemkin has invented a new word to define a new crime, the destruction of groups, a Nazi master plan, as he put it, an amalgam of the Greek word genus, meaning tribe or race, and the Latin word side, killing. In the summer of 1945, Lemkin is hired by the American government to work on war crimes, and he too begins to work with Robert Jackson and his team, but totally separately from Lauterpacht. He pushes for his idea of genocide, a crime for which he wants the senior Nazis to be indicted. He's focused on the destruction of groups, and in particular, Poles, Jews, and Roma, and he wants it to be included at Nuremberg. In August 1945, Lemkin is greatly disappointed that the Charter will include the concept of crimes against humanity, but not genocide. He travels to London and he takes active steps to get the concept of genocide included not in the Charter because it's too late, but into the indictment of the individual defendants. And against all the odds, he succeeds, and the word makes it into the draft indictment. In early October, the four Allied powers agree the final text of the indictment, and it is included not as Lemkin wanted it under count 4, crimes against humanity, but in count 3 on war crimes. And on his definition, it includes the ill treatment and murder of civilians in occupied territories, including Lemberg and Volkowisk, where his parents live, although like Lauterpacht, at that point in 1945, he has no information about the fate of any of his family members. The indictment against the individual defendants alleges that the Nazis conducted deliberate and systematic genocide, and this will be the first time the word is ever used in any legal instrument, national or international. And it comes with Lemkin's definition, the extermination of racial and religious groups, explicitly mentioning Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. The indictment is filed at the Tribunal on the 18th of October. I went to London. I succeeded in having the inscribed charge of genocide against the Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg being included. The trial opens on November the 20th, 1945, And Lauterpacht is present in the courtroom with the British team pushing for the protection of individuals. Lemkin is by now back in Washington with the American team pushing for the protection of groups. So they've got two separate initiatives that are underway. One of the 22 men in the dock is this man, Hans Frank, who is the fourth man in my book, East-West Street. He too, like Lauterpacht and Lemkin, is a lawyer, and from the late 1920s served as Adolf Hitler's lawyer, an early supporter of the Nazi Party. In 1933, he becomes Bavarian Minister of Justice, and a couple of years later sets out his credo at a conference of lawyers held in Berlin. He says, and I quote, "Community takes precedence over the individualistic, liberalistic, atomizing tendencies of the egoism of the individual," end of quote. The words generate thunderous applause, and in his case, of course, as we come to know, such precedence of the community will lead to mass killing. In October 1939, he becomes Governor-General of Nazi-occupied Poland, and in August 1942, he will visit Lemberg and Galicia, recently incorporated into his territory. He'll host a concert, which will finish with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and he'll give a series of speeches in which he will, in effect, announce the elimination of the city's entire Jewish population. Amongst those who are caught up in the mayhem and horror that follows in the coming weeks are the families and friends and teachers of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, as well as my grandfather Leon's entire family. For each of those three families, there will be only a single survivor in the region. In this way, Hans Frank becomes the connector between those three different families. Frank doesn't seem unduly perturbed by such actions and writes approvingly of them in his diary. 3 years later, in May 1945, Hans Frank is caught by the American army near his home in Munich, south of Munich. With him are his diaries, 42 volumes, and a remarkable collection of artwork. And when I say remarkable, I mean remarkable. It included, for example, the portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, the lady with an ermine, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in about 1489. The painting hung in Hans Frank's private rooms in the Wawel Castle in Krakow. And some of you may have seen it there, or perhaps in London, as I did, when it was the centrepiece of the Leonardo exhibit 3 or 4 years ago in London at the National Gallery. It's back now at the Wawel Castle. Hans Frank's son, Nicholas, who I have come to know, tells me that as a young boy, his father liked to make him stand before the painting and slick down his hair like Cecilia Gallerani. And now Frank is in the dock. He is an accused, and he's charged on 3 counts, including crimes against humanity and genocide. On that first day of the trial, the Soviet prosecutor takes the judges to what happened in the city of Lviv. He describes the murders and tortures and other ill treatment at the concentration camps and other establishment in the eastern countries. He calls them acts of genocide, and he evokes explicitly the events in Lemberg in August 1942, in the days that followed Hans Frank's visit. More than 133,000 people tortured and shot in Lemberg in that period, he will tell the tribunal. 8,000 children killed alone in just 2 months in the Janowska camp, right at the heart of the city. As the words are spoken, Lauterpacht and Lemkin do not know whether the victims who are being talked about include their families. Indeed, at this point in the trial, in late 1945, they are not aware that the man they are prosecuting, Hans Frank, may be directly implicated in the unknown fate of their own families. On this day, in November 1945, the terms genocide and crimes against humanity are used in open court. That is the first time for both. I know Lauterpacht and Frank to be in the same room on this day, and I'd often wondered whether there was a photograph of them together. Lauterpacht's son, Ellie, tells me there's no photograph, but I don't quite believe him. I will hunt for it. A friend introduces me to the archive of Getty Images in London, the largest collection of images, photographs taken on that opening day of the trial. And I spend a full day in West London going through hundreds of old glass plate images, each of which has to be taken out of its little paper envelope. After several hours, I finally find this picture taken from a different angle from the one that we're used to. In the top left-hand corner, you can see Lauterpacht sitting at the end of the British table, the second on the left. Elbows are on the table, his hands are clenched under his chin. He seems attentive. He's sitting directly behind counsel's lectern, and the judges who are on the left, out of picture, are being addressed by a Soviet counsel. If you move to the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the familiar large figure of Hermann Goering in an oversized light-coloured suit. And then if you move along the bench, you will see just 6 along, just before the image is cut by the protruding balcony, the semi-bowed head of Hans Frank. Divided by no more than a few tables and chairs, here they are. I found them together, Lauterpacht and Frank, together in the same room. The trial will last a full year, and the judgment is handed down over 2 days, on September the 30th and October the 1st, 1946. The 70th anniversary was recently marked in courtroom 600 of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, which is still a working courtroom as well as a museum. And for any of you in this room, if you find yourself in Nuremberg, it is well worth going to visit that remarkable room. I hope you'll understand my reluctance to avoid revealing the totality of what transpired over the course of that remarkable year of the trial, as the lives of those 3 men became increasingly intertwined. Suffice it to say that the connections were totally unexpected, a series of happenings which the British historian of that period, Anthony Beevor, has described in his review of the book as being so remarkable that no novel could possibly match them. The point that I'm making, the only point that I'm making, is that those personal journeys, Lauterpacht, Lemkin, Frank, coincided in ways that produced an outcome to change the course of legal history and then history itself. The ideas and endeavours of Lauterpacht and Lemkin influenced politics, history, culture, my life, and your lives. The concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide thereafter entered our modern world. And to many, it seems they were always there. One of the more remarkable things, as I've talked about the book since it came out 6 months ago, is people just assume these concepts have existed forever. They have not. They were invented in the summer of 1949, the product of creative and inventive minds, of 2 men driven by their own experiences, forged on the anvil of a single city. Lots of questions persist. Why did Lauterpacht opt for the protection of individuals rather than adopting the path of Lemkin, who embraced the protection of groups? That's partly a matter of speculation. Their backgrounds were broadly similar. They studied at the same university. They had the same teachers, as I've now discovered. Indeed, if you want to trace the origins of these 2 crimes, you can trace them to the heart of old Lemberg, to the events of November 1918 and the 3 years that followed, straight to the law faculty. You can even trace them, as I have done, to a single teacher the 2 men had in common, Professor Julius Makarewicz, a Polish professor of criminal law. And I went even further, because I wanted to see the room in which Makarewicz taught, still a working classroom today, although now not the law faculty, but the biology department of the University of Lviv. It was in this very room that Makarewicz shared his ideas, and he was something of a nationalist, it has to be said, on the treatment of minorities. He was not a believer in individual rights, and he was not a believer of group rights, and he was totally against the 1919 Treaty for the Protection of Minorities imposed upon Poland in the summer of 1919 as the price for independence and statehood. There's something else that also has struck me as quite remarkable. Despite the 2 men's common origins, common interests, and common journeys, and the fact that I have on occasion been able to locate them in the same city on the same day, although never in Nuremberg or in courtroom 600, where they kept missing each other, sometimes by just a single day, it seems that Lauterpacht and Lemkin never actually met. The concepts they put into international law, crimes against humanity and genocide, inform, as I said at the beginning, my daily working life. And I frequently wondered how it could be that I ended up doing the work that I do. My quest to understand Lauterpacht and Lemkin was surely driven by my own family history and by stories that must have been buried away deep in family crypts, no doubt for protective reasons. Along the way, I did much more detective work. I did discover who Miss Tilney was, and you are now looking at her. I came to understand that this was the lady to whom my mother and I and my brother have reason to be deeply grateful, a remarkable and courageous woman who was a missionary at the Norwich Surrey Chapel and who had moved to Paris in the mid-1930s, motivated by the sermons of her pastor to do good and to protect people from Nazi oppression. More remarkably, she was inspired, it seems, by a single line of chapter 10, verse 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans. And it seems that that slightly strange interpretation that she adopted, which you can read about in the book, caused her to travel to Vienna in the summer of 1939 and save my mother's life. Remarkable for me that Paul's letter to the Romans should be the reason that I'm standing before you today. I also uncovered the identity of the man in the bow tie. It was a journey that took me first towards the east and then towards the west, across rivers, across oceans, through masses of Austrian telephone directories from the 1930s and the 1940s. I even hired a wonderful private detective in Vienna and made extensive use of Facebook. I ended up in Massapequa, Long Island, in New York State. Here I was given access to this photograph, which had lain for many years in an attic and which unlocked the family mystery. It's a single photograph taken in a garden in Vienna, probably on Brahmsplatz, in the spring of 1941. It is dated on the bag. And it shows my grandmother with two men in white socks. I learnt, as I was analysing this photograph, the important symbolism of white socks in Austria. It was a way of showing support for the Nazis after the party was banned following the assassination of Dollfuss. One of these men is the man in the bow tie from the beginning. He is my grandmother's lover, and it is a discovery that catalysed the end of the story and the road to finding the identity of my grandfather's lover. How remarkable. They'd been married barely a year and they were already in this kind of situation. Even more remarkable was the discovery that my grandfather's true love was his closest friend, Max. Such efforts took several years and involved the assistance of a range of absolutely remarkable individuals literally across the world. These are the requirements of an exercise in personal archaeological enterprise. But perhaps even more remarkably, and entirely unexpectedly, I learned of the more direct connection between my family and the Lauterpachts and the Lemkins. I was astonished to learn that my great-grandmother, Amalia Buchholz, my grandfather's mother, happened to have been born and lived in the same small town where Lauterpacht was born, Żółkiew. Indeed, even more remarkably, both were born and lived on the very same street, which you're now looking at. It's called Lemberger Straße, or at least it was called Lemberger Straße back then. Lauterpacht's son, Elie, happens to have been my first teacher of international law at Cambridge University and my mentor. But 3 decades would pass. It wasn't until 2014 that I managed to work out that we shared a connection to the same street that the writer Joseph Roth would call East-West Street, hence the title of the book. In the course of the research, which then continued, I followed Amalia's life. My grandfather never spoke to me of her. Her life began in proximity of the Lauterpacht. The first street she walked on was Lauterpacht Street. I learned that her life ended in September 1942, on the 23rd to be precise, in the kingdom of Hans Frank. I found the last street that she walked down. It was Himmelfahrtstraße, the street to heaven. It was the street that led from a railway platform to a gas chamber at a camp called Treblinka. Just 3 weeks later, Lemkin's parents, Bella and Joseph, walked down that same street and died in the same chamber. It seemed to me remarkable that the last street she would have walked down was the last street the Lemkins walked down. In this curious way, Amalia Buchholz's life was bookended, caught between the Lauterpachts and the Lemkins. And 70 or 80 years later, mine too is bookended by the Lauterpachts and the Lemkins, but in a very different way. How does one begin to understand these points of connections? How do we explain such coincidences? I start with the ideas of these two remarkable men, Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and the enduring relevance of their ideas today. The relationship between the individual and the group is deeply contested and has been contested across the ages. I was reminded of this when I came across a letter written by Lauterpacht to his son Elie as he was preparing the draft of the closing arguments for the British prosecutor at Nuremberg, Sir Hartley Shawcross, in July 1946. Lauterpacht had just learned that all but one member of his Lemberg family had been murdered on the orders, in effect, of Hans Frank, whom he was prosecuting. You can imagine that this would have been a time of intense anguish, of both personal grief but also professional challenge. He writes to his son to explain that he manages to find solace and strength in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he explicitly mentions the Matthew Passion. Remarkably, at around this time, in the summer of 1946, Hans Frank tells the US Army psychologist who's attending to his needs, Dr. Gustav Gilbert, that in these most trying of times, he too is imagining and thinking about the work of Bach, and he mentions explicitly the Matthew Passion. How remarkable it seems to me that two men on opposite sides of the same courtroom could find solace in the same piece of music. I've come to understand the work's resonance for Lauterpacht. He was absolutely fluent in German, so he would have understood the libretto, which reflected Bach's emphasis on a pietist belief in the individual. Every aria but one in the Matthew Passion is sung as Ich, I, and the three landmark choruses sung in the first person plural. In this way, Bach is signaling the bypassing of the priest, celebrant, and the church, the bypassing of the group, allowing the individual a direct connection with God. For Frank, with his scathing disregard of the integrity of the individual, the connection is more difficult to understand, not least since many interpretations of the Matthew Passion treat it as a scathing attack on the Catholic faith to which he had converted just a year earlier, following a failed suicide attempt. Lauterpacht believed that we should concentrate on the protection of the individual, and I'm sure he would continue to argue that today. He thought Lemkin's invention of the concept of genocide to be practically useless and even politically dangerous. He believed that it would replace the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of the group. And in a way, my own practical experience concords with that view. I've observed for myself that by focusing on the protection of one group against another, there is a tendency to reinforce the sense of them and us, to amplify the power of group identity and association, which is a source both of sustenance and of danger. How does this happen? In seeking to prove that a genocide has occurred, in law you have to establish, as I mentioned at the outset, an expression of an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. I have seen for myself in cases in which I have worked how that process reinforces both a sense of victimhood of the targeted group as a group and hatred towards the perpetrators as a mass, as a group. But of course, I also understand what Lemkin was trying to do. He recognized the reality that in most, if not all, cases of mass atrocity, it is targeted not against individuals, but against people who happen to be a member of a hated group. Lemkin would say, and it's a very powerful argument, that the law must reflect that reality, that it must also recognize and give legitimacy to that feeling that we all have of association with one or more groups. This profoundly strong sentiment was brought home to me very recently. I wrote an article a few months ago for the Financial Times magazine, a long profile of Dr. Jan Kieselhahn, a German psychologist who has established a remarkable program, actually, to assist the Yazidi women and girls who have been enslaved, tortured, and raped by individuals associated with ISIS. Jan Kieselhahn helped set up the program that has brought 1,100 of them to Germany for medical and psychological treatment. I'm ashamed to say that not one of them has been allowed to enter the United Kingdom or the United States. Jan Kieselhahn has explicitly identified in his work a connection between the possibility of getting justice and the future well-being of individual victims. For him, characterizing what happened to these young women as a genocide is a vital first step. He welcomed the use of the word by the European Parliament, by the Obama administration, and eventually, and in the face of opposition, strong opposition from the British government, the UK Parliament. Calling it a genocide, Dr. Kieselhahn explained to me, recognizes the group's identity, recognizes what is being done to it as a group, and recognizes its right to exist as a group. For him, the implication is that crimes against humanity is simply not enough as a label for what has happened to these extraordinary young women. Nevertheless, I remain concerned that the hierarchy that has emerged is problematic. It puts genocide atop the list of horrors, so that nowadays call something a crime against humanity or a war crime, and it's somehow seen as unimportant, a lesser evil. If you label something a genocide, it will be on page 1 of our newspapers. If you label it a crime against humanity, it probably won't make it into the newspapers at all. If it does, it'll be page 13 or some such place. That is a reflection of the power of the word genocide, invented by Rafael Lemkin. And it's a reflection, too, of our powerful association with the idea of protecting the group. So what, one might ask, is the enduring legacy of these two legal terms? After Nuremberg, there was a period of quiescence. 5 decades passed before international criminal justice was catalyzed by the events in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, by the arrest of Senator Pinochet, by the creation of the ICC, by the events of September the 11th, and the actions that followed, taking us through Afghanistan and Iraq and into the world of ISIS and Daesh and the Yazidi women and girls of whom I've just made mention. And today, as we know, once more, a poison of xenophobia and nationalism is coursing its way through the veins of Europe. I see this for myself on my journeys around central and eastern parts of the continent, in Hungary, in Poland, in the Ukraine. Those of you who've seen the film My Nazi Legacy will have observed me standing in a faraway field watching large numbers of people dressed in Waffen-SS uniforms, celebrating the creation of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division. That's in July 2014. It is impossible for me not to have gone through the experience of writing East-West Street over the past 6 or 7 years, an immersion, a total immersion in the world of the years between 1914 and 1945, and not feel an acute sense of anxiety as to what is stirring. It's happening in my own country. You can smell change in the air, a move towards identity politics. One former London mayor, Ken Livingstone, offensively evokes Adolf Hitler as a supporter of Zionism, and another, Boris Johnson, remarkably and shamefully our Foreign Secretary, offensively suggests that the EU and Adolf Hitler somehow share common aims. We saw what happened in the United Kingdom with Brexit, and we watch now aghast with horror as to what is happening in the United States as executive orders are signed listing entire religious groups and nationalities as being prohibited from entering the United States. So this is the modern context in which I oscillate between the views of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, between the individual and the group, between the realism of Lemkin and the idealism of Lauterpacht. I can see the force of both their arguments, and I can recognize the tension and the struggle between the idea of the individual and the idea of the group, between the idea of crimes against humanity and the idea of genocide. These tensions will not soon be resolved, and international law today embraces both concepts. And this is where I end East-West Street, standing in a long ago place of mass killing, in a field, caught between different poles, between my head and my heart, between intellect and instinct, between recognizing the need to value the inherent worth of every human being, but understanding too the powerful pull of tribal loyalty, and knowing the essential truth of the notion that we are indeed haunted by the gaps left within us by the secrets of others, and the possibility that the discovery of such a haunting will not necessarily destroy us, but could actually make us stronger. Thank you very much for your attention. It's a thrill to talk about this in Hamburg and in Germany.